behalf of the Lethbridge Public Library for joining us for Aminder Dhaliwal in conversation with Dyck as part of the Word on the Street Lethbridge Book and Magazine Festival. I'd like to thank the Allied Arts Council of Lethbridge for sponsoring tonight's event. We'd like to begin the evening by acknowledging that we are gathered on the lands of the Blackfoot people of the Canadian Plains, and the Lethbridge Public Library pays respect to the Blackfoot people past, present, and future, while recognizing and respecting their cultural heritage, beliefs, and relationship to the land. The city of Lethbridge is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. Tonight we are joined by Aminder Dhaliwal and Dyck. Aminder Dhaliwal grew up in Brampton, Ontario, and received a Bachelor's of Animation from Sheridan College. She now lives in Los Angeles, where she has worked as the director at Disney TV Animation, a storyboard director at Cartoon Network, and storyboard director on the Nickelodeon show Sanjay and Craig. Dhaliwal is a variety animator to watch. Her first graphic novel, Woman World, was serialized on Instagram, where she garnered 250,000 followers, and it appeared on 25 Best of the Year lists, as well as receiving nominations for numerous awards, including the Eisner, Ignatz, Harvey, and the Stephen Laycock Medal. Cyclopedia Exotica, published in May 2021, is her second book and was featured in the New York Times, LA Times, and Globe and Mail. Dyck is a cartoonist and art educator living in Lethbridge, Alberta. Has shared his love of cartoons and comics storytelling with folks of all ages for more than 25 years. Has been documenting his experiences and ventures in Southern Alberta through his webcomic, Slaughterhouse Slew. And uses his comic strip to share about the people that he meets, the stories that he hears, and to celebrate the critters and flora of Southern Alberta. His work can be also found in Wider Horizons, The Sprawl, and YY Scene, and you can find out more about Dyck and his work at ericdyck.com. Thank you, Dyck and Aminder, for joining us. Just a note to our audience that if you have any questions, feel free to type them into the question and answer button at the bottom. And about the last 10 minutes of the presentation, we will read out all your questions for Dyck and Aminder. Thank you again for joining.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank
you. And welcome, Aminder.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And given that we are talking during the very dramatic pandemic that the world is experiencing, I do want to start with just checking in. How are you doing?
How am I doing? That's a tough question these days, isn't it? Isn't that like a no-go zone? I'm doing all right considering everything. I've spent a lot of this year maybe, not feeling sorry for myself, but feeling guilty for feeling sorry for myself, which is unfortunate, I guess, because we've all had it hard and there's no competitiveness, I guess, in who's had it the worst, but it's been rough.
How you've been? I've been doing okay. I'm better off than a lot of musicians and actors who are having really tough times. I'm able to bumble along with the internet and with comics, finding my way. But so very fortunate that way. I spoke to some authors the other night who each had a book that was released during the pandemic, and they all had experiences. Only one of them didn't have an experience of releasing a book before the pandemic. This was her debut, and very tragic. Didn't get to go to any school visits or be a rock star that way or anything. You did have that experience of a book before the pandemic, Cyclopedia Exotica. Tell us a little bit about it and tell us a little bit about what your experience has been so far as a book launch.
Sure, yeah. So Cyclopedia Exotica came out entirely during the pandemic. It came out earlier this year, while Woman World came out in 2018, and I got to experience the complete opposite. Like you said, I got to tour around, I got to have that rock star feel, ask for your M&Ms in the back room. You don't get them, but you buy them for yourself. But it was a very different experience of just, being in a room full of people. That energy is so different. And I didn't realize how much of an effect it really had on how much people can be I can suddenly turn to your book or find you as an author just because they happen to walk into an event. They happen to be walking by an event and they heard you. I did a Comic-Con event where I think most of the room was waiting for whoever was after me. It was very clear. They kind of came in halfway. They were like kind of like looking at their like watches for the first little bit. And then later when I went and did the signing, a whole bunch of people were like, very honestly told me like, I wasn't there for you, but I happened to just get so intrigued by what you were talking about that I had to come buy your book. And there's just kind of none of that now. It's you're just kind of hoping someone notices your work and this just like avalanche of like books coming out. And then you're also doing so many events, kind of like there's all these online events now. So it kind of feels like you're still on tour, of course. And there's, if anything, a lot more, but there's none of the pats on the back. Like if anything, it's like you close your Zoom window at the end of all these events and then you just kind of go back to the darkness, and it's very jarring. But I really did like, yeah. It's just me alone. It's just me and my wallet. But I'm glad I got to experience both, because like you mentioned, like having, if to have your first book to come out during this time, it's just so different. And it's probably just so hard to explain to any first-time author how different it is, because it's so hard to describe what makes a book tour fun. It's when you describe it in so many words, it actually doesn't sound that fun. It sounds kind of like panic inducing and like a lot of like you comparing yourself to other authors, but it really is something special. So I hope eventually I'll get to do a lot of in-person events, but I am really grateful that I got to do a lot more international events, thanks to us all having to figure out how to live online.
That energy that you're describing from meeting people or sharing your story in a room full of people who are varying degrees of excited about comics, it makes me think about, I've seen a few references to you online as the Instagram artist. How do you feel about that? Is that an appropriate descriptor?
It feels, it's an appropriate descriptor because that is quite literally how I've launched my career. And it also feels really dirty and like wrong, and like it makes me feel like I'm not a true comics artist or a true author because I didn't do it some other imagined way that you're supposed to do that. So it gives me strange vibes where I feel like if I was any more confident, I would just embrace that and say like, hey, that's how it's worked out for me. I don't know if I'd recommend it to anyone else, but I also feel like it gives me this sense of inauthenticity, I guess, that there's some proper way in how to become a graphic novelist, and there just really isn't. So I wish I was more confident with that title. Bring it on.
I find your relationship to social media fascinating because that's not new in the world of comic stripping. And I think about Schultz and Dan Ferraro, Bill Watterson, and Dyck, Calvin and Hobbes have all spoken out about the disconnect they felt with their audience as a newspaper comicer. Some of them even described creating comic strips as sending a joke away in the mail and then waiting for weeks and weeks and weeks to see if anyone laughed. And we don't have that luxury with social media anymore. Tell me a little bit about serializing your comics on Instagram and why that was a good fit for you, but how you manage that, because being the cesspool that social media is, I'm sure that you have to be careful.
Yeah, I can take it back to the beginning where I was on Instagram just like any other user. And then in 2017, I had just finished a big project at Nickelodeon, and it was my own pilot and it hadn't gone anywhere. And I'd been working on it for 4 years. And I walked away just feeling so defeated, rejected. But the most surprising feeling was that I just felt like I had wasted so much time because all of this work was hidden behind NDAs. And that's the classic, like, there's a power issue there where I felt like I couldn't do anything with all this work. And even then, when I looked at it, I just didn't even feel like sharing it, even if I did it on the side, because it now felt like it was tainted. So I wanted to build a better relationship with art. So I love doing comics, and I'd already been doing diary comics. Not to say they were good, and I since haven't really done many more of those, but I did enjoy doing diary comics, and I really appreciate when people can keep those up. I find it fascinating. It's like the most interesting form of a self-portrait, I think. But I decided that I wanted to make more comics that were not related to me at all. More fictional, and where they would take me to just like a new area of my art or kind of expand me as a storyteller. So I started this first comic called The Magical World of Henry Peter, The Scientific World of Henry Peter, which was a spoof on Harry Potter. And it was a scientist, it was a wizard who finds out he's a scientist. And so it's just all the classic like spoofs I was taking. And I was just like making sure that I got like all the big obvious jokes. And my only goal with that comic was that, because it was a simple enough idea, was to make something consistently and to post it irregardless of how I felt about it. So I posted for 2 weeks daily, just pictures out of my sketchbook. I didn't do anything fancy to them. And that got me in a rhythm. I started to feel like, okay, like I could keep this up. This is a nice feeling. I just get to put something out there. And then I did another comic called Mild Inconvenience, which was a spoof off of Death Note, where instead of finding a book in Death Note where you can like write a person's name and they die, instead in my spoof, it was Mild Inconvenience. The character finds a book where if you write the name of a person, they're mildly inconvenienced. And I had a really fun time with that. And that was an even longer comic. And again, I was doing it kind of daily. It was a new art style. I got to try new things. But it didn't feel like too much pressure either. It was really fun, and it got me into just having fun with art again. And then around 2018, so this is like 2 months later after I've started doing these comics, we head into 2018, and that's when I had the idea for Woman World, where I had gone to the Women's March a few months after the election, and I'm like hanging out with friends, and I see all these signs that say the future is female, and I start coming up with this idea and what would it be like. And how I could make it fun and like just funny versus like not too like sci-fi heavy and scary. And so I put up the first comic, and I think I had at that point maybe like I brainstormed like 10 altogether, like comic ideas for like that basic idea. And I posted it, and it just kind of started to blow up. And that was my first time of getting whatever that like viral, I guess, like would be the right word, of like, oh, people I don't know, and people who I can click on, and I don't know how in any way that they found this, are commenting, are liking, are sharing, and getting to be behind the scenes. I got to watch, like I don't have that much access in television to how a TV show I work on, how it affects the world, but getting to be behind Instagram, I could see all those insights, as they call them. I could see the analytics, I could see who's sharing, I could see how many comments are coming in. So I found it really fascinating. And then I just continued like staying in that world for more than 10 comics, obviously. And I just had so much fun in it. And I just gradually grew an audience, never having used any sort of a hashtag other than the hashtag Woman World, so that people could find all of them if they wanted to, or didn't have to follow me to follow the comic. The bad side of that was on the first comic is the only time I've used another hashtag. And I used the International Women's Day hashtag, because that was roughly when I posted. I think I posted it on International Women's Day. And I can tell people the only person searching International Women's Day is someone who is not all for it. So I instantly got some heat for posting my comic. But like, in retrospect, there was enough of a conversation on that comic that it was probably really good for whatever the algorithm or whatever. But since then, I didn't really like that kind of attention. So I kind of stopped doing that. And I preferred when people would just recommend it to each other. So like you were saying earlier about like the disconnect, with these early like newspaper comics, I get to experience the complete opposite of that, where it is instant connection and to a fault. I have to stop myself. I have a very I have a fast and loose rule of like, generally I don't look at comments until a few days later. Lately, I've been just jumping in and actually like I've gotten to a much better place with how I feel about my own art. So I'm happy to jump into comments now right away, whether they're good or bad. But I had to kind of create this space for me. So it was a little less like, writing a joke and putting it in the mail. And it's more like just turning around to the person next to you to get kind of an instant reaction. So there's a good and a bad, because that person could turn around and be like, that's great. But also people on the internet love telling you when something is not great. Or how much they dislike something, or why something's not working. So there's a dark side to it, but it has worked really well for me. And since then, I got to finish Woman World. I decided at 100 comics that, hey, I don't know if I see this idea becoming a long form webcomic that continues forever. So I want to kind of end it. And that's when I decided I would try and make a book. At that time, I thought self-publishing was the best route. And luckily, Drawn and Quarterly happened, all through submitting on their website. And after that,
Drawn and Quarterly happened.
When you have nothing to lose, I guess, where I had a PDF made of just like a whole bunch of comics together. And then I looked into self-publishing and it looked so hard. I don't know how people do it, especially when they want to print an actual physical book. I think it's much faster if you're making an ebook. But to print a book, the distribution side of it is impossible to replicate. So I was just like, hey, I have a PDF. Let me just go to my favorite publisher and like see if I can like send it in. And I'm so glad they actually checked those emails. And then I kind of replicated that with Cyclopedia Exotica, hoping people would stay around for my next comic. And now I'm even on to another comic after Cyclopedia, and it's worked well for me. But when people ask me like questions that almost sound like they want to do the same thing, I can't feel like, I don't feel like I can encourage it, because it's also a different beast now from when I started on it. And I luckily already had an audience before it started to change how whatever the algorithm works. So I don't always feel like I'm the best person to give advice either.
I don't know that I've seen any other web cartoonists do this, but I believe that you took down Woman World and took down the comics for Cyclopedia when the books were launched. Do I have that right?
No,
you can still go back to the archives.
Yeah, you can scroll back and see how much I changed. Yeah, it's all still there. I mean, it takes quite a bit of scrolling because there is so much content on there, but I just always wanted there to be a kind of a free option, I guess, because they tell not a different story. They are quite literally the same comics, but they feel so different from Instagram. When they're in a book, there's just a different tone when you get everything together in one book. And so I was happy to leave them up. I'm sure there'll come a point which I'm like, this doesn't quite represent me as an artist anymore. But I also like the idea of like, I like going and stalking someone and seeing like how they became the artist they are today. So I'm sure people do that to me.
You didn't get any pushback from Drawn and Quarterly over that?
Not at all.
Excellent.
And I was just so grateful that like, yeah, I never got any. And I don't think it has affected the sales at all either. Like, I don't think there's that many people who, I guess one of the things is it's actually so difficult to go reread them all, even if you wanted to. That like at some point it is just more beneficial to get the book, but I don't think it ever actually like impeded the sales to do it that way. I also had them up on Webtoon. Before Drawn and Quarterly ever got involved, I was trying to figure out another way to put them up somewhere. And also because Webtoon at that time had ad revenue. And I was like, oh, this is exactly what I need. And I put them up there and they're still up there. And I will go to conventions and some people will like walk by and then like stop and be like, wait, I know that comic from Instagram, and come buy the book. And just as many people will be like, I know that comic from Webtoon. Wow. So I was really surprised at like just the different audiences, how they come together, how they converge, and how excited people are to recognize something in the bookstore or feel like they found something before everyone else did. So it kind of creates this inner circle.
As an animator, it's doing storyboards primarily, I believe. And your sense of timing and your control of timing is impeccable. And when I was looking at the swiping and, swiping through Instagram has been great for web cartoonists because we can kind of force people to go panel to panel a little bit better. But you've got to reformat those a little bit, do you, for the book? Or what considerations, what was a challenge for you when you went from Instagram to the page?
Oh man, yeah. I mean, I remember the days the swipe feature came to Instagram, because that was the day I decided to start making comics on Instagram, because that was exactly what we'd all been waiting for. Before that, like having to post the entire comic as one blurry image was so hard, or having to do multiple posts. It was, I mean, it's not made for us, right? So it's really like odd that we're trying to just force this program to do what we want it to do, and it's just not made for any of it. But it is really hard to switch over from Instagram to a book for multiple reasons. The first is the style. I mean, Instagram by nature, I'm doing the daily strip style, and there were times where I wanted to weave in a bigger storyline, and it didn't feel like Instagram was the best place to do that, where people were just looking at my comics daily, didn't remember what had happened last week. So I kind of felt like I had to drop some of the storylines, which then I was able to kind of better add back to the books, because most likely people are sitting down in one or two sittings, probably even just one with Woman World, and getting through all of it. So they don't want to be refreshed on why a character is the way they are that many times. It's not going to have that sitcom feel, isn't going to work as better if everyone's just constantly resetting. So there are things like that I had to look for. The next one was because there is no swipe feature, I felt like when I would lay out a comic onto usually 2 pages, that sometimes the final punchline, the final panel was just like so bright and like so obvious. Like if you turn the page, I felt like that was the first thing you would look at, and including as you turn a page, it's often that final corners where you're looking. So I felt like really exposed with some of the jokes that like I didn't want people to see those first. So then I would have to figure out a way to move those onto the next page and kind of figure out my own new style of timing, I guess, through comics. So through the panel count. So there was a couple of times where I would just feel it out. A lot of times I didn't need to do it, but the few times I did, I think it made the books that much stronger to be like, oh, you turn the page and then you see the punchline, and it hits that much harder because you thought it was over, but it's not. The hardest part, though, is honestly this a little more internal. I have this argument that goes on in my head where I think people seem to think it's really easy because all the content exists, and now you just have to put it into a book. No one has ever said that to me, but in my head, I'm constantly arguing with everyone, being like, it's super hard. It's actually really hard to do. So I do, like, I can't imagine just like having blank pages and then like having to lay out the entire comic all in one go. But I did have to like take all these panels, refigure out how they work on usually 2 pages at a time, and then feel for the flow all over again. And then also want to add something which made it worth it for the person reading the book versus reading the webcomic version of why is it better when you hold this book, when you can feel the pages in your hand. So there were things I would try and do extra special. I would redraw a lot of the comics as well. I'm sure that's something most comic artists notice, is that your first few comic pages versus your last few comic pages, you really learn how to draw the characters right at the end. So you have to kind of go back and be like, hey, the first quarter gets a little airbrushing going on. So there's a lot of that. And then I try and do some like secret things here and there just for me.
So when you mentioned bringing things in, trying to make that book worth it, I absolutely think that happened with Woman World. Cyclopedia Exotica, you really went all in for that idea. Can you tell folks a little bit about what you added to the physical volume of Cyclopedia?
Yeah. So for anyone who doesn't know, Cyclopedia Exotica is like this series of comics about the minority experience told through the lens of a Cyclops in a two-eyed community. And the idea honestly didn't even start off that thought out. I knew that I wanted to do something with monsters, and I had started to use my Instagram as just like this brainstorming place. And so I had discovered that I really liked drawing Cyclops as pinups because there's something interesting about the monstrous meeting the sexualized. I was like, oh, this is like an interesting space to explore. And I thought it was very like interesting with Cyclops because other than the eye, and sometimes they're kind of, giants in some stories, there's not much of a difference, not in description. A lot of times in the art, there's a big difference, but in the description, it's usually just the eye. And so I thought it was interesting to use this one tiny difference that pops up as the core of like the race issues that I then explore in the comic. But I also just aesthetically really enjoy drawing a Cyclops with a mono boob and then seeing what that looked like as a pinup. So it started off as just like, okay, some interesting pinup drawings. What can I do with this? And then I started being like, okay, I can like explore more of like how race works into this. I was a little worried about like, I'd already covered gender, woman world. Now I was like going into race. I was like, oh gosh, like what am I asking for? So I go into that, and I kind of found the story as it started. I had some ideas of where I wanted the characters to go, but it took a little while for me to like get there. Then when the book came along, I got to really sit down and think about what I wanted to say with these characters. And in doing that, I got to explore, one, why did I name it Cyclopedia Exotica? I had known that like from internally for me, I knew, and I had told Tracy at Drawing Quarterly this, that the reason for me was that it's the difference between studying something when you see it in a book versus living it. That was the difference. And so I got to introduce that into the book with, it starts off as encyclopedic pages, and then the character literally like leaps off into the comic and says like, why don't you come see what it's really like being one of us? Which I don't think that would have worked on Instagram, and I didn't even try. Very, very different. Then I got to also add in this children's book that I had mentioned multiple times in the webcomic, Susie's One Eye, which one of the characters especially really, really hates this children's book. That kind of came from me coming from children's animation, where we have a habit of oversimplifying and retelling a lot of the same stories, which are a lot of like be true to yourself in one way or another. So it's just like my kind of like nudge to that. And I got to actually put the children's book into then the book form, which was really exciting for me. And I got to change art styles, and it was just really nice having the space to do that. And then I got to add in an appendix at the end with my explanations of why the characters' names are their names and what I wanted to do with those characters. And I had felt that that was important because for a long time I had thought about adding just like a quick list of questions or something, almost like if you were to at school and it's like a study book or something of like, what did you think of this character? But in order to bring it back into the encyclopedic feel as the bookend, I thought it would be also fascinating to get to discuss my choices with the reader. I've experienced that moment, and I feel like a lot of people do, because reading is so personal and private, where you finish a great book and it's just you and you have no one to talk to, and you just had a cool private experience, and now to go on with your life. And so I wanted to give the reader a moment where they got to just talk with me a little bit, and they got to hear my sense of why I did what I did. And hey, in a perfect world, I would get to hear everyone else's responses, but I wanted to give that one side of the conversation at least. And then, of course, there was also a whole bunch of brand new comics that went into the book itself. I always love getting to do brand new comics for the books. But yeah, that's my long answer.
Did the new comics come after the serialization? Or were they ones that you chose not to include on Instagram?
They all came after. They were usually like roughed out ideas that I decided not to go with, or that felt just weren't figured out, usually like a little too confusing, and I just needed more time to kind of process and how I would tell them. And then some of them I try and make a PDF as quickly as possible of my books. I like, it can be blank page, and then like one comic, and it's like I'll just keep making different versions of the PDF until I one day have the final one. And that's something I just, coming from animation, we make a rough cut of an episode kind of as quickly as possible, and then we keep changing out things. And when I would see the PDF, I would reread it every time. And there were certain characters that felt like they needed another beat to tell this part of their story, or they needed more context, or even sometimes it was just like, we need a reminder of something before another comic with them appears. And we need to be reminded of some important piece of information about them. And so I'd find like the right place to kind of put that in.
Can you give us an example of one of the characters that you felt needed to be lifted up a bit more or needed a bit more context?
Sure, yeah. Arj in the book has a lot more of a backstory, and there's a bunch of his memories appear in the book. And then he has this entire storyline which doesn't appear on the Instagram version, other than there's a few comics of his past which aren't accompanied by saying that they're his past. They're just one-offs, but he has this entire storyline with a bully who would bully him, and then he gets to have some closure with this bully on the back end. But I chose not to put any of the comics on Instagram, partially because I had put on in his memories as one-offs, and then it felt like, well, I can't suddenly put in the storyline of a bully, so I just chose not to do any of it. So there were times where it felt like there's that kind of a character. There's how Etna plays into each of the other characters' lives was important to me as well. They're a little more disjointed on Instagram, but Etna has kind of an effect on every single storyline, big or small, but she is such a cultural moment for Cyclops that she does have an effect on every one of the storylines in some way.
Can you tell folks a little bit more about Etna?
Yeah, so Etna is the original pinup that appears on quite at the beginning of the book. And she, let me find it. So she appears right away and kind of throws us into the story. And very quickly we learn that she's a little bit older than most of our other characters. She kind of was the first Cyclops to be accepted by two-eyed culture. And I wanted to explore how you can be accepted through sexualization. Almost like that's an easier way to swallow a different culture, is to be like, if you can sexualize them, you can probably accept them. That's like one of the paths to it. So she is both viewed as this pioneer, but also as this darker element of that she kind of had this effect of Cyclops then being over-sexualized. So she kind of balances on both sides of that, depending on where we are in time. When she first does it, she's a pioneer. A few years later, there's a backlash. She's the reason so many people are sexualized now. And then again, given another decade, and suddenly she's everyone's hero again. And the cycle just continues. She is the first character I came up with, and she's named after the volcano, and so I knew I wanted to make her explosive, quite literally like the volcano, and I had to then kind of gauge how that had affected everyone else.
I really loved seeing the arc of Etna's role in pop culture. And the way that it influenced so many different levels of life. The sexualization, certainly one aspect, but many more. And then to look at Susie's one eye and the way that it had such an important role, a formative role in many people's experience, and also, perception of it in contemporary culture is quite conflicted. So you had been playing with the pinups when you were first playing around with the idea. Tell me about your choice to actually illustrate Susie's one eye, especially given that it's not exactly something that's celebrated by all the characters in the book.
Yeah, I knew quite early that I wanted to make sure the entire book was somewhere. There was an idea of just it being over like 2 pages before I decided to kind of just commit to putting in the full book with all the illustrations. I didn't know what the book was. I knew that the book was always going to be about being true to yourself, but I didn't know the exact words for a very long time. And there's so many versions of it that I have like tucked away. But the decision to put it in was a lot based on, I wish I had better words for this, but a lot of it's based off of feeling when I do look at my own work and what feels right to add somewhere. Because my option was either having that storyline affects the character Braun the most. And my choices were either having him read the book off screen and have him change having read it, or to have the audience get to experience it with him. And just the second option was just so much more exciting, to have you not know what the book is about, but it seems to really anger this guy, but everyone else seems to love it. And it's on all these bookstores, and it's just this big children's book that everyone at least knows of. And then to get to experience all that baggage and then get to experience it for the first time. It's kind of like you don't leave the reader a choice of how to feel because they know there's so much baggage on it. You didn't start the book with it, but you end it off. It gives you a different feeling. And especially then I bookend it on both ends, the children's book with Braun reading it for the first time, being like, all right, like, let's go. And then his own reaction to being like, oh, it's not at all what I remember, which is very much my own experience with children's books, where I think I knew exactly what happened. And then as an adult, I've gone back to read them and I'm like, I imagined much like different things. And I didn't even realize the power of fewer words, where like I had imagined completely different scenarios with the same characters. And then I go back and reread the original and I'm like, oh, like, no, that never happened in it. That was like something I came up with. And it's like really powerful. So it was a little bit of that, my own experience with children's books, and but very important to Braun's storyline. And I just felt like you had to read it as the audience.
I really enjoyed it being at the end because as it was coming up in conversation within the context of the comics, as a two-eyed person reading it, I had no idea what Susie's One Eye was about. And that felt like, it felt very much like I was in that world of misunderstanding or not relating to the characters.
It's good. My fear was always that like, I really hate in television shows and books when you're following like some really interesting storyline and we get to like the apex, like it's like climax, and then you're suddenly cut back to like something that happened 4 years ago. And I always feel like so robbed as the audience. And I'm like, wait, no, I want to get back. You're not going to be able to convince me to stay here now because it's all like so slow. And like, I get it, there's context, but there's a very specific place I feel like that context needs to go. And it has to be when a lot of things have wrapped, or if we're going to go backwards to some other time, or in this case to the children's book, we have to have had the storylines wrap up a little bit, because that was my fear. That was just like, where do I place it where it doesn't feel like, oh, we're finally getting to this interesting like storylines, and now here's a children's book which is like 14 pages in the middle of the story, and I'll just try and get through it as fast as possible. So I feel like it was in the best place it could be.
Wonderful. Well, it really stood out, and really, I could tell that you relished making that element and how different it felt, and that was great.
Definitely, it gave me a new appreciation for children's books.
Really? Yeah.
Yeah.
Before we get to the Q&A with Jonathan, I did have just wanted to talk a little bit about burning, if that's okay. Everyone should be headed to Aminder's Instagram. Burning maybe started a couple months ago, or is it?
Yeah, I think it's like 2 months now.
2 months?
I have no sense of time anymore.
And so a very different format. I can't help but wonder if something was sparked in doing Susie's One Eye that affects the formatting that you've chosen for Burning. What I'm very much interested, though, is in the world building. So the world building of Woman World and the world building of Cyclopedia Exotica feels very different approach in Burning to the world you're creating. Do you want to tell us a little bit about Burning?
Sure. So on my Instagram right now, I am updating bi-weekly a new story called A Witch's Guide to Burning, which I wish I had a synopsis ready because I don't want to give anything away. But it starts off, you start off with a character who has been burnt at the stake and doesn't remember anything. And very quickly, she's joined by a couple other characters who are going to help her heal. it's very different from my other work, coming from the daily strip, or coming from like more of a daily strip style, and much more of a punchline kind of comic world. I had to literally put a disclaimer on the first post to be like, this is going to be very different. So goodbye to a lot of you who don't want to be around for this. But if you trust my storytelling, please stick around. I've never thought about the connection that it like with Susie's One Eye, that like some of my wanting to tell a longer storyline might have come from that. I have been writing this story since early 2020. I think even around late 2019, some of the earliest art exists, where it was less of a story and more a bundle of ideas. So I've had this with me for a very long time, and I've gotten to explore the world for quite a bit before posting it, versus all my other comics have been kind of in the moment, and like the audience gets to kind of discover them with me, other than I'm kind of outlining a little bit ahead of time. So world building usually for me is starting micro and then going to the macro. I'd like to kind of get the audience started off with like, hey, here's a day in the life. And like, you might have more questions. I actually think it's really good when you're like, wait, what? After a comic, and it kind of keeps you bringing in, keeps you reading. For Woman World, the first comic starts with an announcement that all the men have gone extinct. I think that's a question to want to keep you around for a little bit at least. Then with Cyclopedia, like very much so, it was about like how race affects like each of these characters. And every now and again, I would bring up a different way in which their lives, their daily lives are affected. And it was very intentional with Cyclopedia because I wanted to show how microaggressions add up. Each comic is kind of its own microaggression. And when you have it as a book, it stops feeling micro and starts feeling quite macro. So it was very intentional to use the daily strip style for that type of story. And that was coming off of Woman World. It was like what I felt like I enjoyed about daily strip, and what I didn't like. The not liking was you don't get to really serialize, you don't get to really follow characters on a bigger journey, because that's not what the author is, or that's not what the reader is really there for. And you might be asking a little too much of them unless you can give them the full book. And then after Cyclopedia, I felt that, okay, I've kind of explored a lot of this world now in daily strip style. Now I want to tell a bigger story, and I want to know if I can. I want to challenge myself. I don't want my third book to be another book, which is daily or bi-weekly Instagram punchlines. So I started outlining this whole book, and kind of started it the same way as my other comics, where I started off micro, and then I would figure out why things were that way, and slowly kind of get into the more macro elements. There's a lot more thinking involved.
You're experiencing that micro to macro with the protagonist.
Yeah, I really enjoy the portal style sci-fi and fantasy, where you get to step into a new world, but I didn't want to also do a portal fantasy. So this kind of was the next best thing, where it was like, she definitely lives in that world, but she's forgotten everything. And it felt like the best way to bring in an audience and have all these questions answered with her, alongside her. And it's been really exciting. It's been really validating as well to post it and see the great reactions. It's been really hard as well. I've changed the art style. I'm being a little more dramatic in my lighting and my choices, which I also just think when you switch out of comedy is usually quite flat. It works best. You know, you go for that punchline, you go for a wide. There's this nice language in comedy, and where the drama, it's like all the opposite. It's like dramatic lighting and angles here. And so that's been quite hard to get used to, of how exhausting the drawing can get. And I've also made some very complicated characters, I suppose. But the other element I really wanted to explore was how to meld writing with graphics. And I didn't know that I was craving something from books that I wasn't seeing that often, and that it was one of those moments where I was like, I guess I'm just the one who's going to have to try and do it. And let's see how we can merge comics better with writing. I kind of felt like for a while, I was seeing a lot of comics where it was very clearly written by one person and drawn by another. And there's something about like the panel word count that was starting to bother me. And this is especially true for like superhero things where it's like someone's about to give a big speech, but they can only have so many words per panel. So we're going to do like 8 panels of just that same character, but in different poses. And I would look at it and I would feel so bad for the artist. Because to me, it was like, if as an artist, I would much prefer if you told me, give me one bold page, tell me everything on one page, make it so powerful. And hey, we'll just have a giant slab of writing. Why not? That would be much more exciting to me rather than being like, okay, I'm going to have them put their finger up here and do poses that like a lot of people don't really do in real life, and like have slight slight eye movement. It just felt like it wasn't using the medium in the best way possible. So I wanted to try and elevate that, and also, you know, have to do less as an artist. And then the others. You always think it'll work. You always think you can
are so lush. They're wonderful.
Happened with Cyclopedia too, where I was like, hey, they have one eye. That's like half the drawing. Did not work out that way. Suddenly I couldn't do a lot of expressions. So I really have enjoyed like exploring how to use language in a new way. And I still think I can probably take it further, but I'm in the early steps of it, where I want the page to invoke a feeling. When I write the word burn, if I have it actually burning, I think that there's something powerful to that. Sorry, I'm like holding a pen. And then like every now and again, I just feel like there's a moment where you can add to the art by like switching over to the writing and then having the graphics in there. And it's very important, I feel like, as an artist and as a writer to remember that like language, the alphabet is an illustration, and to kind of go back to that and to remember that rather than as this like completely different element, it's getting to experience the alphabet as art again. And it's been really exciting, and I hope people enjoy it, and I hope anyone who's here goes and follows.
It's absolutely very immersive, and it's really quite wonderful. Really looking forward to seeing the progress of Burning.
Oh, thank you. It's exciting stuff.
Great. Jonathan, do we have any questions popping up?
We don't have any questions so far, but I'd just like to remind the audience, if you do have any questions, we have about 10 minutes left. You can just, at the bottom of your screens, there's a little button that says Q&A. Just give that a click and you can type in any questions that you might have for Aminder or Derek, and we can get those in before we end for the night.
Yes, please. Whenever these events happen in person, I feel like it's even worse, where it's like, okay, time for audience questions. And then you turn and just look at like everyone's faces and they're just looking right back at you. And there's the confusion of like, I guess one of us should ask something.
It just means I get to ask another one of my questions. All right. One thing I would like to address is one of the most excruciating aspects of Cyclopedia Exotica is when we get into the internal dialogue of the characters, or we start to see, you mentioned having trouble with the Cyclops emoting, but experiencing some of those microaggressions and seeing those emotions throughout the interaction with the two-eyed person is incredible, and it's very eye-opening for me, thinking about your allegory of the minority experience. I certainly want to ask about your very specific immigration story of your own.
Oh man, I feel like it's an ongoing journey. So I grew up in England. I was born and raised there until I was 11 or 10. I don't quite remember now. And then I moved to Canada. My mom decided to move us all. And I feel like I was at that perfect age where everyone has a story of moving at around that age, like usually between, I don't know, 9 and like 14. And that's the first time I feel like you realize that your parents have their own lives because they don't do everything for you. And you as a kid are like, moving, no, like all my friends are here. Like let's stay here. And they don't listen to that logic. That logic doesn't check out. And it's kind of like the first form of betrayal from a parent to be like, oh, they're thinking of themselves is what it feels like. Although usually there's like bigger reasons for it. But moving to Canada was the first time I realized I had an accent. I had a thick British accent, which, you could argue is probably like one of the easier ones to have between like all of them moving to a new place. But I had never realized I had an accent, and suddenly everyone was asking me to say things, repeat things, and say, like, picking up words I'd said. And it was very odd to me, and I became much more introverted. I went from being the loudmouth in my class in England to being like, always being like called out for giggling too much in class and talking to my friends too much, to going to Canada and becoming silent. And like, then you just find me in my sketchbook, you'd find me in a book, you'd find me just like on my own. And so kind of got me into drawing that. So that's like kind of like the good side of it. I kind of tried to lose my accent as fast as possible. I was in that age where you just want to be part of the group. You want to be part of the crowd. You do not want to stand out. So Canada, I went to middle school, high school, and then went to Sheridan College. And in that time, we became permanent residents. I didn't even experience any of it because I was just a kid, but I just like had a permanent residency card one day, which all I knew was that it was before you turn 18, you should try and get this because it becomes a lot harder after that. And so I got to, have a little element of England now and Canada, and what feels like life is just the citizenship game where everyone's just trying to get a little piece of everything so you can move around a little more easier. So after that, after college, I had realized that I really wanted to try moving to LA and work at the studios out here because I was in animation. And even if it wasn't forever, I wanted to make sure that I got that experience. And so that's when I got introduced to visas and how extremely hard and frustrating it can be. I went from multiple visas, TNs for a long time, J1s, if this means anything to any of you. And then eventually an O1, and I got to then apply for a green card. The green card process was, I think as an artist, you already spend so much time unsure of whether you are good or not. You spend so much of your time wondering if any of your work is worth anyone's time. And then I would describe the green card process as the government asking you why they should care about you. And it's like this brand new, much larger element of like you questioning if you are worth the land you want to stand on, if it's worth you taking up that space. And so it's quite traumatic going through it. You have to get all these recommendations of why you are why you're worth a green card. And you kind of go through these like trials and tribulations, and you have to have this like entire personal experience of getting over your own insecurities to have to argue that no, you're a big deal. You have to kind of argue that, and it feels very, very fake. And then I finally got my green card in 2018, and it was just so liberating because then I got to work on, that's when my books started, because I couldn't for a long time work on books because I was being kind of held hostage to one company. And it was just very liberating. And I haven't even thought about immigration since. I know I could very soon, probably in the next 3 years, probably start looking into citizenship if I wanted to. And then in between there, I had a couple of bad experiences. There's one in Cyclopedia Exotica of me on the bus that's like quite literally from my life, where a woman just started saying, there's me and one other Indian person on the bus, and she just wanted to make sure we had a horrible day. And it was like scary. And I remember getting off the bus and she was like still yelling at me. And I don't think anyone had quite prepared me for how much, it's not that you just like, that was a, horrible experience. It's that you're going to be in a real bad mood for like the next month. Because the next day when I went to take the bus, I was like scared. I was scared she would be on it again. It ruined, obviously, the whole day I had. It was in the morning. So like the entire day I was at work, I was just like thinking about that. And then every day until it kind of blurred away into other memories. And then honestly, the same, I had a few in Canada where people were like not great when I like first moved. And a lot of it had to do with, if I'm honest, probably like 9/11. Just like I moved in 2000, and then like within like a year, and especially within 2-3 years after that, got to experience like just what the media especially, and just how people are reacting to this big catastrophic event, and how much my skin color could trigger people. And then quite recently, when the Asian hate started again, I had a conversation with someone about how so many minorities, like when someone else has the heat on them, it's almost like you're like, oh, okay, like it's on, the spotlight's on someone else now. Like I get to just like chill out for a second. It's like a very odd reaction to have, because it's very horrible to react that way. But when I spoke to some people, they're like, oh, I know that exact feeling. Yeah, like that's a very universal minority experience, to be grateful that another minority is in the spotlight instead. It's odd.
Well, I hope you feel that your Cyclops comics did that experience justice, and from an outsider's perspective, they're pretty raw emotions on the page there, so they're quite rich. Aminder, we do have a couple of questions here. Hi, Aminder. This is from Anonymous. I love your work. My question is, how do you create a fictional world as you write a story? Do you have problems with plot holes and missing pieces?
Ooh, I have luckily not had too much of an issue yet. That's just the question now to like force me to find some plot hole. I got to knock on wood. With Woman World, it was post-apocalyptic, so it felt very reactive. All I had to think about was what had been and how are we reacting to that. With Cyclopedia, it was an alternate universe. So there was a lot of homages to like things we already do, which makes it interesting then in this kind of alternate world where you get to experience life slightly differently. With Witch's Guide to Burning, which I'm doing now, it's a brand new fantasy world. I have an entire like book written up of rules, and I wanted to do like what I thought authors did, whereas I like actually write down how the world works and the world mechanics and the magic system. And so it's my first time trying it like that, and I actually have the entire storyline already written out. That being said, I still feel like you have to be open to changing things as they go, and when you do find like little holes and things like that, that's also like very much how life works. We as a narrative storytellers, we get to like kind of put a pretty bow on everything and make sure that, hey, if something happens here in the beginning, that it has an effect on the end, and it had meaning. Every step has to have meaning. But in reality, like most of your day doesn't really have much meaning in the broader sense. It doesn't drive you constantly to become the better person that you want to be. It's usually just you flossing your teeth or something like that. So I'm quite forgiving to myself if there are like holes or if something isn't quite working. In comedy, I think the best idea is to just say it and give a little wink to the audience and be like, hey, did you find this plot hole? Because I did too. I don't think people are as forgiving in drama. I also think you have to be harder on yourself to make sure that they aren't as big. And if there are any, make sure that the emotions are there. I have never finished a book or watched a movie and thought, wow, the logic was top notch. Gonna recommend everyone this because the logic was so great. It's actually been the opposite, where I can watch a movie or read a book and there could be glaring holes of like, wait, that didn't make sense. But if they got me with the emotions, I will come up with a reason for why that logically made sense. I will argue it. I will just savor for that. I will wait for someone to bring up that plot hole so I can be like, well, actually. And hey, if Tolkien couldn't answer why they couldn't just use the eagles, I think I'll be forgiving to myself of plot holes.
I love to hear that, because that's on a macro level. Then we go back down to the micro level, and in Cyclopedia Exotica, your characters have some very contradicting emotional responses to some of the things that they're experiencing, or their behavior contradicts what they may have just said, and that's life. That's really nice. We have a question from Killane. If you don't mind, just taking a moment to answer one more question. This is broad. You are stranded on an island. Which art supplies do you miss the most?
My go-to if I have nothing, it's pencil and paper. I keep it really simple. I almost always have a pencil and paper on me. So if I got stranded on an island, I probably have those things. But things I've learned to love as well. Honestly, you gotta love Photoshop and a Cintiq. As much as we all also complain about them, those things make our lives so much easier. And I've gotten Witch's Guide to Burning is all inked. I've gotten better with ink, but I don't think I'm quite there yet. I'm actually still quite scared of it, so I wouldn't miss that at all. And I also, no one prepared me for how much ink you will just drop as a person. Like, the amount of times I have found ink stains on me is just so frustrating now. So pencil and paper is how I started, and it's my go-to always. What
That's
about you?
To hear. For me, paper and ink as well. But me for work things or to tight turnarounds. And, I've been inking on an iPad for about a year now. And it's quite a leap from the disconnect of the Wacom to the drawing right on the screen for me. I made that jump pretty late, but it's when the ink's flowing. When the ink's flowing onto the paper, that's when I'm at most at home. Yeah.
I respect it so much, because I just didn't really learn how to respect the page, respect the ink flow. I don't know the right kinds of pages to use. All the paper I even still use is from a garage sale. I was walking past, it was right when I moved to LA, and I was walking past a house, and this person had a whole bunch of art supplies. And I was like, oh my gosh, are you an artist? And he was a comics artist who was just about to move to Japan. And so he had all these supplies that he didn't need anymore. And I was like, well, I'll just take it all. I'll figure it out. And I got this giant stack of really nice thick paper. Wow. That I don't know what type of paper it is. I have to, I'm almost out now, and I have to go hit a paper store and ask them for that exact type. But for years I didn't use it because it felt like it was this has got to be for something special. And now I've been using it entirely for A Witch's Guide to Burning, and I've run out so fast. The stack that I thought would last me for so long, I'm like, oh gosh, there's 8 pages left.
might need to start crowdsourcing on social media to find out what that paper is. Yeah. I don't know, maybe do you feel like you could just jump onto another paper, or are you feeling quite particular?
Oh, I would probably need your advice on some really good paper for inking, because I still feel like I have a heavy hand. So I feel like there's a little bit of I don't know the correct words here, but I lose a lot of ink to the paper, and not the way that I want to lose the ink. Right. I go through. I think I'm refilling my nib way too often. I can tell that I'm doing things wrong, and I want to get better, but I'm only getting better while I've already started this project. So it's a little daunting, and I also feel like I have to go back and just do the same mistakes I was doing. Thankfully, I'm not cross-hatching or doing anything even harder than outlining. I use a brush pen, which has been really nice. That feels a little more at home. And then I sometimes just use a micron to get in there with fine details and stuff. But getting used to whiteout has been fascinating to me, because I'm just so used to being able to Command Z and just fix something. But having to commit has been hard.
I hope that in the end that you find it somewhat freeing, just a constraint that's hard to recreate digitally, that I find really rewarding and gets me past some dithering or some indecision sometimes.
Oh, that's good. I feel like it's gotten really dark on my end.
Oh, that might be our cue to wrap things up. Aminder, thank you so much. I really appreciated your generosity talking about your projects, and for spending some time with us tonight.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been lovely. This was such a wonderful conversation, and I'm feeling excited to go make some more things now.
And we look forward to when you can come see us in Canada again.
Oh, absolutely.
That wraps everything up tonight. Thank you both, Aminder and Eric. It's been a fascinating discussion listening to you both. And so, everyone, I hope you have a wonderful night, and thank you for joining us.
Go on Instagram and read Burning. Thank you so much. Bye now.
Thank you. Bye.